This is my true story. My wife's funeral was 30 years ago. I carried her coffin with my own hands, stood in the rain, and watched the earth swallow the woman I loved. I spent decades talking to her photograph, living with her shadow, and sleeping beside her empty side of the bed. But last week, when someone knocked on my door, everything I believed shattered in a heartbeat. Because when I opened that door, she was standing there, alive. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe so more people hear my story. My wife's funeral was 30 years ago. I remember that morning clearly, the sky heavy and gray, like it wanted to cry for me. People came dressed in black, holding umbrellas that shook in the wind. I stood beside the coffin as it was lowered into the ground. My hands gripped the rope so tight that the rough edges cut into my skin, but I didn't let go. The sound of the soil hitting the wood was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of everything ending. When the crowd left, I stayed behind. I kept staring at the small mound of dirt until rain started falling on my face. I didn't move. I didn't care. I just wanted to be buried beside her right then. When I went home that night, the house felt like a grave. Her shoes were by the door. Her scarf still hung on the chair. The bed was cold and wide. I sat in the dark and listened to the rain hit the windows. Every drop sounded like her voice fading away. For weeks, I could still smell her perfume on the pillows. I talked to her photo every night before I slept. I said, "Good night." I said, "I miss you." I said everything I should have said when she was alive. Years passed, but the pain stayed the same. I never remarried. People told me to move on, but I couldn't. How can a man move on when half his heart is under the ground? I kept her things exactly where she left them. Her dresses stayed in the wardrobe. Her brush stayed on the table. I even kept her teacup on the shelf, clean but untouched. It made me feel like she was still somewhere in the house, just out of sight. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the hallway, I swore I heard her footsteps. I would call her name softly, but no one answered. Every anniversary, I went to the cemetery with white lilies. I stood there for hours, speaking to her stone like it could listen. I told her how quiet the world had become. I told her how I still worked, still cooked, still breathed, but never lived. The graveyard man said I was the only one who came that often. Maybe I was. Maybe love made me foolish. But she was my whole life. I had built that house for her, every brick laid with my own hands. And now all that was left of her was a cold piece of stone with her name carved on it. 30 years passed. 30 birthdays, 30 winters, 30 empty dinners. I stopped expecting anything from life. I learned how to exist in silence. The neighbors changed, the town grew, but my house stayed frozen in time. I would wake up, make breakfast for one, and stare at the second plate I never used to fill. At night, I would sit by the window, watch the streetlights, and imagine her walking down the road again like she used to. But that was just a dream I kept alive to survive the days. Then one night, everything changed. It was raining again. The same kind of slow, steady rain that had fallen on the day I buried her. I was half asleep in my chair when I heard it. 3 soft knocks at the door. Not loud, not strange, just 3 light taps. The same rhythm she used every time she came home late. I froze. My heart began to pound. I thought maybe I was dreaming, maybe my mind was playing tricks again. But then I heard it once more. 3 knocks. Slow, gentle, real. I stood up slowly. My knees felt weak. My breath grew shallow. I walked toward the door like a man walking toward a grave. The old wood creaked beneath my feet. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking. I pulled it open, and my heart stopped. There she was. The same face I had kissed goodbye 30 years ago. The same eyes, the same hair, the same small scar near her lip. She looked older, yes, but alive. Completely alive. The photo I had spoken to for 3 decades had just stepped through my door, and the world I knew ended all over again. After that night at the door, the world I built over 30 years started to crumble again. I had lived in silence for so long that even the sound of her breathing felt like a ghost passing through the house. For 3 decades, I had trained myself to live without her, to eat alone, sleep alone, and wake up to the same empty walls. Now she was sitting in the same chair she used to, looking around like nothing had changed. But everything had. The house had turned into a museum of grief, and I was the guard who never left his post. Before she returned, my life was a quiet pattern of old habits. I would wake up before sunrise, boil water for tea, and sit by the window watching the streetlights fade. I spoke to no one unless I had to. The mailman would wave, sometimes leave a newspaper, but that was the only voice I heard most days. Her clothes still hung in the wardrobe, and I never had the heart to move them. I dusted her photograph every Sunday, the one taken on our wedding day. Her smile in that picture was the last light that ever touched me. I talked to it every evening, telling her how the weather was, how the neighborhood changed, how much I missed her. I didn't expect answers. I just didn't want the silence to win. The years made me smaller, quieter, softer. My hair turned white, my hands stiff, my eyes weaker. I learned to live like a shadow. The house became both comfort and prison. Every room was filled with memory. The kitchen still smelled faintly of her perfume. The drawers held recipes she wrote by hand. The garden grew wild because I couldn't bring myself to cut the flowers she planted. Even the walls seemed to whisper her name when the wind blew. I thought that kind of loneliness would kill me one day. Not all at once, but slowly, like rust. Sometimes I wondered what life would have been if she hadn't died. I imagined her gray-haired, reading by the window, asking me to fix the old radio again. I imagined us growing old together, laughing about the small things. But that dream stayed locked inside me. I never spoke of it. People in town forgot her name after a few years. They stopped asking about me. To them, I was just the quiet widower in the house near the church. They didn't know that I still set 2 plates on the table every night out of habit. One for me, one for her. I never ate from the second one, but it felt wrong to take it away. Then she came back. The sound of her voice tore through the silence I had built, like glass shattering. I didn't know what to say. My mind couldn't understand what my eyes were seeing. 30 years of pain, of tears, of learning to live without her. All of it suddenly meant nothing. She was here, alive, real. But my heart didn't know whether to break again or to beat faster. She looked around the room like a stranger visiting her past. Her eyes stopped at the photo frame on the table. She smiled faintly. "You kept everything," she said. Her words cut through me like cold wind. I didn't answer. My throat was too tight to speak. She touched the chair she used to sit in and sighed. I felt like I was watching a ghost touch my memories. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat awake in the chair across from her room. I heard her walking, opening drawers, moving things. Every sound made my skin crawl. I wanted to believe it was really her. But something inside me felt wrong. The house that had been dead for so long suddenly felt alive, but not in a good way. It felt haunted, like love had turned into something that shouldn't exist. When the sun rose, I saw her standing in the garden, humming an old song she used to sing while cooking. My heart hurt watching her. She was real, flesh, bone, breath, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that she had brought something dark back with her. 30 years of peace had ended the moment she knocked on that door, and deep inside, I knew the storm wasn't over. It had only begun. It happened on a night like any other. I had finished my tea, washed the cup, and sat in my chair near the window. The street outside was empty, quiet, and still. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall, steady, slow, and lonely. I remember closing my eyes for a moment, just resting them, when I heard it. 3 soft knocks. Not hurried, not loud, gentle, familiar. The kind of knock that didn't belong to a stranger. For a moment, I thought it was the wind. But then it came again, 3 times, with the same pause between each one. My heart froze. I hadn't heard that pattern in decades. My wife used to knock like that when she came home late from work. 3 times. Soft, even, and certain. I opened my eyes and stared at the door, waiting, but no one spoke. I felt the air change in the room. Cold crept up my arms. I stood up slowly, one hand on the armrest for balance. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, louder than the rain outside. I took one step, then another, my legs shaking as I moved closer. The hallway light flickered once. I thought maybe the bulb was dying. Or maybe I was. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the handle. I could feel the cold air leaking through the cracks. The wood was old, rough under my palm. My fingers trembled as I turned the knob. The hinges groaned softly. I opened it just enough to see. And then, there she was, my wife. She stood there, alive, standing under the faint yellow light of the porch lamp. Her hair was streaked with gray but still long, still tied the same way she always wore it. Her face had aged, but her eyes were the same, deep, calm, knowing. The small scar near her lip, the one she got from a fall in our kitchen, was still there. I felt the blood drain from my face. My knees went weak. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. I thought I was seeing a ghost. My throat burned, my chest ached, and every memory I buried came back all at once. 30 years of grief collapsed into that single heartbeat. She looked at me with a soft smile, like she had just returned from a short trip. Rain dripped from her coat onto the porch. Her voice came out quiet and steady. "It's me," she said. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My tongue felt heavy, my body frozen. I stared at her, waiting for her to fade, for the air to turn cold again, for the world to tell me I was dreaming. But she didn't disappear. She was breathing. Real. Alive. My wife. The woman I buried with my own hands. I stepped back without realizing it, my hand still clutching the door. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Aren't you going to let me in?" Something inside me broke. My mind screamed no, but my heart couldn't move against her voice. I opened the door wider. She stepped inside, her shoes leaving small wet prints on the floor. I watched her walk through the hallway she once decorated with her own hands. Every step she took made the past come alive again. I felt dizzy, trapped between memory and madness. She turned toward me and said my name, slow and gentle. I had heard that sound in dreams, in prayers, in lonely whispers to her grave. Hearing it again felt like a knife and a blessing at once. I wanted to ask where she had been, how this was possible, but the words wouldn't come. I just stood there, shaking, staring at the woman I mourned for half my life. That night, the world changed. Death had come back to my door, not to take, but to return what it had already claimed. I didn't know if it was mercy or punishment. All I knew was that the woman I buried 30 years ago was breathing under my roof again, and my heart didn't know whether to live or die. She stood in front of me like no time had passed. Her face carried the same softness I once kissed goodnight, the same calm in her eyes that used to quiet every storm inside me. But now, that calm felt wrong, too still, too knowing, as if she had come back from a place no living person should. My mouth stayed dry. My thoughts were tangled. I wanted to speak, but the air felt too heavy to break. For 30 years, I had spoken only to her photo. Now the real thing was standing in front of me, and I could barely breathe. She said my name again, slowly, gently. The same tone she used to use when I came home tired from work. It struck something deep in me, a sound both comforting and cruel. My eyes filled before I could stop them. For decades I had imagined this moment in dreams, her return, her voice, her smile. But not like this. Not at my age, not in the middle of a storm, not after I had already buried the hope of ever seeing her again. I wanted to ask where she had been. I wanted to ask how she was alive. But the questions stayed inside my chest, locked behind shock. She walked past me like she still belonged here, her eyes scanning the room as if measuring time through dust. The old furniture, the photos, the dried flowers, everything she had left behind was still there. Her gaze lingered on the table where her framed picture still stood. I saw her lips twitch slightly, not quite a smile, not quite guilt. She turned to me and whispered, "You kept it all." I couldn't answer. My hands trembled too much. I leaned on the chair to keep from falling. She looked older, thinner, but alive. There was no mistaking her. Every detail matched the woman I had carried to her grave. The curve of her neck, the shape of her hands, the way her hair curled behind her ears. It made no sense. None. My mind tried to reason, to find something, a trick, a dream, a ghost, but nothing fit. She was flesh and bone, standing where death should have kept her. She stepped closer, her scent faint but familiar. I felt the world tilt. My heart was racing in my throat. She touched the table, tracing the edge of her own photograph. "You never changed the house," she said quietly. Her words were almost tender. Almost. I wanted to tell her I couldn't, that everything I had done since her funeral was for her. But the words refused to leave. Instead, I just stared, frozen between disbelief and heartbreak. She sat down on the chair across from me like she had every right to. The same chair where I used to imagine her sitting when I ate alone. Her presence filled the air with something thick, something cold. I watched her movements carefully, trying to find any sign that this was wrong. A twitch, a mistake, a detail that proved I was dreaming. But she was perfect. Too perfect. The rain outside kept falling, slow and endless, like the world itself was holding its breath. Then she looked straight into my eyes and said, "I need to tell you something." The sound of her voice made the room spin. That tone, calm, steady, rehearsed. It wasn't the voice of a woman returning from death. It was the voice of someone preparing for confession. My knees went weak. I gripped the edge of the table to stop shaking. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers tightening around the handle of her bag. I could hear her breath, shallow but steady. The clock ticked behind us, 1 second after another. My mind raced through memories, her illness, her funeral, the coffin, the grave. Everything I had lived for 30 years told me she was gone. But here she was, alive, telling me she had something to say. I wanted to believe she came back for love. I wanted to believe life had given me a miracle. But deep down, something told me the truth was darker, and I was about to hear it. She sat at the same table where I had once placed her framed photo. The candlelight flickered between us, throwing long shadows across her face. Her hands rested flat on the table, calm and still, while mine trembled slightly against the wood. The air felt heavy, too heavy to breathe. She looked around the room again, the curtains she had sewn, the faded wedding photo on the wall, the dust-covered vase with wilted flowers. Her eyes softened for a moment, then hardened again, as if she was preparing herself to say something she had practiced for years. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and careful. "I never died," she said. Just 3 words, but they hit me like a hammer. My heart seemed to stop mid-beat. My ears rang. For a second, I thought I hadn't heard her right. I leaned slightly forward, waiting for her to explain. She looked at me, her expression calm, almost detached. "It was all planned," she continued, her voice steady, almost too steady. "I needed to disappear. Disappear." The word echoed inside my head. My mouth opened, but no sound came. 30 years of grief, of loneliness, of conversations with her photo, all built on a lie. I stared at her, trying to understand how a person could bury another person alive in their mind. She kept talking, her tone quiet, rehearsed, emotionless. She said she had met someone before she died. A man. Someone who promised her freedom, money, and a new life. Together, they arranged everything. The illness, the staged death, the closed coffin, the fake paperwork. "He handled everything," she said. "You never even saw the truth." My breath turned shallow. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. She said she had gone far away, started a new life under another name. That she watched me from a distance for a few years. That she knew I was broken, but told herself I would heal. Her eyes glistened slightly as she said, "I thought you would move on." I didn't move on. I built my whole life around her absence. She looked down for a moment, her fingers tracing invisible lines on the table. Then her voice changed, colder, sharper. "He left me," she said. "The man I went with. He took everything. The money, the house, the years. When I got old, he didn't want me anymore. So I came back. I just stared. The woman I had buried, the woman I had mourned for 30 years, had faked her death, lived with another man, lost everything, and returned to me like nothing had happened. I wanted to speak, but no words came. The silence between us grew thick, almost alive. The candle flickered again. She looked at me like I was supposed to understand. She said she regretted it, but the way she spoke didn't sound like regret. It sounded like survival, like she was only here because she had nowhere else left to go. She said she thought I'd be happy to see her. That after all these years, maybe we could start over. My chest tightened. I had lived half my life talking to her ghost, and now she was asking me to live the other half pretending she had never left. I felt something rise inside me. Not anger, not sadness, something colder. Something like truth settling in. The woman sitting in front of me was not my wife anymore. She was a stranger wearing her face. A liar who had let me bury her, cry for her, and grow old alone while she lived another life. Her eyes stayed on me, waiting for a response. I gave her none. I just watched her, silent and still. I realized then that death had not taken her 30 years ago. Lies had. And when she walked back through my door, she didn't return from the grave. She returned from the ruin she built with her own hands. That night, I understood something simple and final. You can lose someone twice, once to death and once to the truth. For a long time I couldn't move. The sound of her words stayed in the air long after she stopped talking. I never died. Those 3 words kept echoing in my head like the toll of a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. My hands were still on the table, gripping the edge until my knuckles turned white. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, fast and uneven. I had buried her with my own hands. I had stood beside her grave. I had cried until my chest hurt. And now she was sitting across from me, alive. And it wasn't a miracle. It was betrayal. She reached for her cup of tea and drank slowly, like this was an ordinary evening. Her calmness made it worse. I wanted to shout, to ask why, to demand answers, but no sound came out. I just stared. The house that had been silent for decades now felt louder than ever. The clock ticking, the kettle hissing, the rain against the windows. Every sound felt sharper, crueler. I looked at her face and saw every year of my life that I had wasted mourning her. 30 years of grief, 30 years of loneliness, 30 years of lies. My chest felt tight. My throat burned. I remembered every morning I woke up reaching for her side of the bed and found it cold. I remembered every birthday I spent alone, every night I spoke to her picture, every time I sat by her grave thinking she was beneath that ground. I remembered how I stopped living because I thought she was gone, and now she was here, looking at me with those same calm eyes, as if she had done nothing wrong. She started talking again, small things, meaningless things. She said life had been hard after the man left her. She said she had no money, no one to turn to. She said she thought of me every now and then. I heard the words but didn't feel them. Each sentence was like another shovelful of dirt over the grave of the man I used to be. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She said, "You'll understand one day." I did what I had to. Understand. That word snapped something inside me. She wanted me to understand the choice she made, to fake her death, to let me break, to leave me half alive for 3 decades while she built a new life. I didn't understand. I never would. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I gripped the edge of the table to stop myself from shaking. My mind flooded with images: the coffin, the grave, the rain, the priest's voice, the cold touch of the rope. I saw myself standing there in the cemetery, believing every lie, saying my last goodbye to a woman who was still breathing somewhere else. The pain I had carried for 30 years turned into something else, not fire, not rage, but ice, cold and deep. She reached across the table as if to touch my hand. I pulled away before she could. She looked at me then, her eyes slightly narrowed, almost curious, like she couldn't understand why I wasn't glad to see her. That small look broke me more than her words. It was the look of someone who believed they had the right to come back after destroying everything. The tears I had held back for years began to fall, but they weren't the same kind of tears as before. They weren't soft or sad. They were quiet and cold, the kind that come from something deeper than sorrow. She watched me cry like she was watching a stranger. That night, I realized something terrible. The woman who came back wasn't my wife. The woman I loved had died 30 years ago, not in the ground, but the moment she chose to leave me for another life. The person sitting at my table was just what was left of her, a ghost wearing flesh. My hands trembled, but my heart turned still. There was no anger left, only understanding. Not the kind she wanted, but the kind that ends everything. The truth had taken the place of love. And nothing that looked like her could ever fill the grave she left in me. That night, I didn't shout. I didn't scream. I didn't ask her why again. The storm inside me had already burned itself out. What remained was silence, a silence that felt heavier than grief. She sat across from me, talking as if nothing had happened. Her voice was calm, steady, too practiced. She spoke of years gone by, of cities she'd seen, of people she'd met. Each word floated through the air like smoke. There, but without weight. I nodded sometimes, not because I cared, but because I wanted her to keep speaking. The sound of her voice was no longer love to me. It was proof of everything I had lost. When I finally stood, she looked at me with confusion, as if she expected kindness. "You must be tired," I said quietly, the first words I had spoken since she entered the house. My voice sounded strange, like it didn't belong to me anymore. She smiled faintly, relieved to hear me speak. I walked to the kitchen slowly, every step echoing against the walls that had once carried our laughter. I boiled water and made tea, the same way I always did. 2 cups, one for her, one for me. Habit doesn't die easily, even when love does. When I returned, she was still talking. I placed the cup before her and sat back down. She took a sip and sighed, saying it reminded her of the old days. My hands were folded on the table. My face showed nothing. Inside me, everything was cold and still. I realized I didn't hate her. Hate would have been too alive. What I felt was emptiness, the kind that comes when you finally see the truth after years of darkness. She spoke about the man she ran away with, how charming he was at first, how he promised her a better life, how she believed him more than she ever believed me. She said he betrayed her, stole her money, left her broken. She wanted sympathy. She wanted comfort. I gave her neither. I only listened, nodding from time to time, keeping my face calm, my breathing even. She mistook my silence for forgiveness. But it wasn't forgiveness. It was distance, the kind that grows too wide to ever be crossed again. In the middle of her story, I stood up quietly and walked to the counter. I reached for the old phone hanging on the wall. My hands didn't shake this time. I dialed a number I hadn't called in decades, a number I remembered from the letters she once hid, back when I still thought she was faithful. A man's voice answered. Rough. Older now, but familiar. I didn't say my name. I only said, "She's back." There was silence on the other end, followed by a low breath. Then I said, "She wants her share." And I hung up. When I turned around, she was still talking, unaware of what I had done. She laughed softly at something she said, sipping her tea like she belonged here. I watched her for a while. The woman who had been my world was now just a stranger sitting in my house, drinking from a cup I shouldn't have filled. My face stayed calm, my body still. I could feel the old anger fade into something colder. A decision. That night, she slept in the guest room. I stayed awake in my chair, listening to the rain and the faint hum of her breathing through the walls. I thought about all the years I had wasted, all the nights I had spoken to her photograph, all the tears I had buried in the dark. And I thought about what I had just done. One call, quiet and simple, to the man she once chose over me. I didn't plan to hurt her. I just wanted truth to finish what lies had started. I wanted her to see what it felt like to lose everything, not to death, but to consequence. She brought the past back to my door, and I opened it one last time, not to welcome her, but to end what should have stayed buried. As dawn approached, I sat still, watching the gray light creep into the room. My hands didn't shake anymore. My heart didn't race. I felt nothing but peace, a strange, empty peace that comes only when you've already lost everything. The phone call was short. No emotion, no hesitation. Just truth passed from one voice to another. I didn't have to explain much. The man on the other end already understood who I was and what her return meant. Time hadn't erased what they had done. I could hear it in his silence, the kind of silence that comes from fear, not surprise. When I hung up, I knew what would come next. I didn't plan it for revenge. I didn't plan it at all. I only set truth loose and let it walk where it needed to go. The house was quiet when morning came. She was still asleep in the guest room, wrapped in the same blanket she had sewn decades ago. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy and gray. I sat by the window with my tea, watching the street. Every sound outside felt sharper, the creak of a passing bicycle, the distant bark of a dog, the soft hiss of tires on wet road. The world felt different, smaller. For 30 years, this house had been a tomb of memories. Now it felt like a stage, waiting for something to end. At around 10, I heard a car stop outside. The engine idled for a moment, then went silent. My fingers tightened around the cup. I didn't move. I heard footsteps, heavy and certain, crossing the gravel path. Then came the knock, firm, direct, the kind that didn't wait for permission. She woke up and called my name, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't answer. She walked past me, still wearing my old sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She opened the door, and there they were, 2 men, both older, both carrying the weight of something that never really dies. Her expression changed instantly. I saw it. The flash of recognition, the panic, the shame. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. They said something I couldn't hear clearly, but their tone was sharp. The taller one stepped closer, blocking the doorway. She tried to step back, but they followed her in. I stayed where I was, silent, unmoving. This was not my scene anymore. It was theirs. Their voices rose. Her hands shook. She reached for her bag, but one of them grabbed it first. Papers spilled onto the floor. Letters, old notes, things she must have kept hidden. One of the men picked them up and read something aloud. Her face turned white. I could see her lips moving, begging, explaining. But the words didn't matter. The truth had caught her at last. The same way she had trapped me in lies 30 years ago, now she was cornered by her own past. It didn't last long. The argument turned into shouting. The shouting turned into silence, a silence that cut through the air like a blade. Then the sound of a door slamming. Then footsteps, quick and uneven, moving toward the car. When the engine started again, I knew it was over. I didn't need to look outside. I didn't need to see what they had done. The air felt different, still, but not calm. Like the house itself understood something final had just happened. I stood up slowly, my knees stiff, my heart strangely steady. I walked to the window and looked out. The car was gone. The gate stood open. The gravel path was scattered with footprints. Near the door lay her cup of tea, cold and untouched, the same one I had poured the night before. I stared at it for a long time. Then I turned away. I didn't call anyone. I didn't check the yard. I didn't speak her name again. She had come back once to destroy the peace I had built, and now peace had claimed her again. In its own way, on its own terms. I poured out the cold tea, washed the cup, and placed it back on the shelf. Outside, the sky cleared slowly. The rainwater glistened on the leaves, and sunlight began to slip through the clouds. I opened the window and let the wind in. The air smelled clean again, like something had been lifted, something heavy that had been pressing on my chest for 30 years. I sat back down in my chair, the same chair where I used to talk to her photo, and breathed deeply. The past had finally finished what it started, and this time I didn't need to bury anything. By the next morning, the house was quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that comes from peace, the kind that follows after something final, something that can't be undone. The air was lighter, but empty. The sunlight came through the curtains, falling on the same table where she had once sat the night before. Her cup was gone. Her voice was gone. Her shadow was gone. Only the faint smell of her perfume lingered for a while, then faded like smoke. I didn't move for hours. I just sat in my chair, staring at the door she had walked through twice, once as a ghost, once as truth. No one came to ask questions, no police, no neighbors, just silence, wide and deep. Maybe they didn't want to know. Maybe they knew already. The town had seen me live alone for 30 years. They must have thought no one came to visit me, and that was how I wanted it to stay. I didn't need anyone's sympathy or shock. I had spent enough years being looked at with pity. I didn't want eyes on me anymore. I wanted stillness. As the hours passed, I started to notice how different the house felt. It was lighter, quieter, but also older, as if time had caught up all at once. Dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts. The clock ticked slower. The curtains swayed softly in the breeze. Everything looked exactly the same, but nothing was. I realized that grief never truly ends. It just changes shape. For 30 years, my grief had taken the form of memory. Now it had turned into truth, cold, sharp, and final. I walked through each room slowly. Her clothes still hung in the wardrobe, untouched since the day of her first funeral. I opened the door and stared at them, the dresses, the scarves, the small perfume bottles that had long since dried up. I thought about burning them, but then I stopped. Fire wouldn't change anything. The dead, real or fake, don't care what you keep. So I closed the door quietly and left them as they were. In the kitchen, I made tea again, only one cup this time. The steam rose in the sunlight, thin and calm. I sat at the table and took the first sip, and for the first time in decades, the tea didn't taste bitter. It was just warm, simple. I watched the light move across the floor, watched the shadow of the window frame shift slowly as the day turned. Life was still moving, even after everything had stopped. I thought about her face one last time, the way she had looked when she sat there, pretending nothing had happened. The calmness, the coldness, the quiet pride. Maybe she had convinced herself she had done the right thing. Maybe she had told herself lies for so long that they became her truth. I used to love that face. I used to think it was peace. But now, all I saw in it was distance. The kind of distance you can't cross even in death. As the evening came, I opened the front door and stepped outside. The sky was red and gold, the kind of sunset she used to love watching. The wind brushed against my face, carrying the smell of wet earth. Somewhere far away, a bell rang from the church tower. The sound was soft, almost like a sigh. I stood there for a long time, watching the last light fade behind the hills. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel sorrow. Just quiet. That quiet was my reward, my punishment, and my peace. I went back inside, closed the door, and locked it. The house felt full again, not with her, not with pain, but with something heavier and calmer than both. She had left me once for another life. She had returned to take back what time had already taken. But time doesn't return what it buries. It only waits. And when it's ready, it finishes the story it began. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. No dreams, no whispers, no knocking at the door. Just silence, and a world finally still. I buried her once, 30 years ago, and I thought that was the end. But the truth is, you never really bury a person. You bury what you know of them. When she walked back through my door, I realized the woman I once loved had died long before the funeral. What came back wasn't her body. It was her ghost wearing skin. It wasn't a resurrection. It was a reminder that time doesn't heal. It only hides the wound until something sharp enough cuts it open again. I sat by the window that night, watching the sky turn from red to black. The house was silent. The air was clean. There were no footsteps in the hall, no soft hum from the other room. Just stillness, the kind that feels almost holy. I thought about everything she had taken from me, 30 years of life, peace, and warmth. But I also thought about what she had given me without meaning to. She gave me an ending, a real one, the kind that doesn't come from death, but from truth. When I looked around the room, it felt lighter than before. The table where she sat, the chair where I waited, the window she used to look through, all of it finally belonged to me again. For decades, I had lived as a half-man, trapped between grief and memory. Now there was only me, the last piece of a story that had gone on too long. I felt no hatred, no rage, only relief, the kind that comes when the last word has been spoken and nothing else needs to be said. I made one final cup of tea and poured it into her favorite mug. I set it on the table beside her photo, not as a gesture of love, but of closure. The woman in the picture still smiled the way she did before everything fell apart. I looked at her for a long time. That version of her, the one who loved me, was gone long before she faked her death. I whispered, "Rest now," though I wasn't sure who I was speaking to, her memory, her lie, or the part of myself that had died with her. Outside, the night was quiet. The trees didn't move. Even the wind seemed to stop out of respect for the silence. I thought about all the years I had wasted, all the prayers I had said, all the nights I had begged the sky for a miracle, and in some twisted way it gave me one, not the kind that brings joy, but the kind that brings truth. She returned not to be forgiven, but to remind me that peace doesn't come from love. It comes from knowing when something is truly over. I didn't cry that night. The man who once wept for her was gone. I sat still, my hands folded, my heart steady. I thought about how strange it was, that she had come back to take something, and left with nothing. The life she built on lies ended exactly where it began, at my door. And this time, when she left, there was no funeral, no grave, no flowers, just silence. And in that silence, I found everything I had lost. When dawn came, I opened the window and let the morning light in. The first rays touched the floor, warm and soft, filling the room that had known too much cold. I breathed deeply, feeling the weight lift from my chest. It didn't matter where she was now. It didn't matter who found her or what they did. Her story had ended the moment I stopped believing it. I picked up her photo one last time, looked at the face I once loved, and placed it gently in a drawer. I didn't throw it away. I just put it where it could no longer watch me live. I stood there, still and quiet, and said the only truth that mattered. She rose from the grave to take more from me, but I sent her back to it with truth as her coffin. Then I closed the drawer, locked the door, and finally let the past stay buried.